He wasn't the most powerful, he wasn't the most feared, but Joseph Barbara, the quiet butcher's son from Pennsylvania, held the match that lit the fire. All he wanted was respect, a place in the world of giants, but in chasing legacy, he opened his backyard to kings and became the man who accidentally brought down their empire. Apalachin wasn't meant to be history. It was meant to be hidden until the shadows broke. As the story begins, tell us where you're listening from and what time it is. If you enjoy the story, like the video and subscribe to support the channel. It began with the quiet rustling of wind through bare trees, the brittle crunch of November leaves beneath polished soles, the kind of morning that didn't know what it was walking into. Cold, gray, and ordinary Apalachin, New York, a sleepy dot on the map where nothing ever happened. But on November 14th, 1957, something did, something that cracked the spine of organized crime in America and made the world look up from its coffee with a jolt of disbelief. At the center of it all was a modest hilltop estate owned by Joseph Barbara, a mid-tier mob figure recovering from a recent heart attack and a man desperate to play host to kings. His white-pillared house stood just outside town, nestled in wooded calm, surrounded by tidy hedgerows and frost-nipped grass. The estate had always been quiet until that morning, when Cadillacs began arriving like slow thunder. They came one by one at first, black Fleetwoods, silver DeSotos, a blue Chrysler with new Jersey plates. Dust rose in lazy spirals as engines cooled on the gravel drive. Inside those cars were men whose names echoed down the alleys of America's cities: Gambino, Genovese, Magadino, Profaci, Bonanno. Some brought muscle, others brought ledgers, but all brought ambition. One local grocer delivering meat that morning said it felt like watching a funeral procession, but with better shoes. The parking overflowed. Lawn chairs were dragged out. The smell of cigar smoke cut through the autumn air. 62. Men arrived, maybe more. Some wore silk scarves and felt fedoras. Others had deep coats and sharper eyes. They didn't introduce themselves by name. They didn't need to. The air was thick with unspoken rank. Inside the house, Joseph Barbara sat uncomfortably in his armchair, sweating through his wool, despite the cold. He wasn't built for this, not anymore. His doctor had warned him, "Avoid stress, Joe." But stress had been the currency of his world for decades. Today he was banking all of it. They came for a meeting, not just a sit-down, not just a reunion. This was business on a national scale, a summit of the 5 families and their cousins across the continent. Territories needed settling, narcotics. Profits needed dividing. There were whispers about Havana, Vegas, even Hollywood. This wasn't crime in the shadows anymore. This was infrastructure, and they had flown in from Kansas City, Cleveland, Chicago, Tampa. Some had aliases and fake IDs. Some just smiled and tipped their hats. But the quiet town of Apalachin was watching. Or more precisely, one man was Edgar D. Croswell, a square-jawed, unflinching state trooper whose curiosity had long been piqued by the odd patterns around the Barber residence. For weeks, Croswell had been tracking out-of-state plates, noting hotel bookings and watching luxury cars glide down back roads. At dawn, this was not a coincidence, and Croswell, unlike many, did not ask permission to act. At 11:15 a.m., he made his move. A team of state troopers fanned out along the narrow roads surrounding the Barbara estate. They didn't carry rifles, just sidearms and notepads. They weren't even sure what they were walking into, a union rally, a political fundraiser. But when they saw the cars, dozens of them, all parked with military precision and polished arrogance, they knew something was wrong, something big inside the estate. The first whispers of trouble began to spread. A glimpse through a lace curtain. A shout from the back porch. Someone had seen uniforms in the trees. Then it happened. The moment the Mafia myth cracked like old ice. Men of power, men of terror, men who had orchestrated murders and elections and coups ran. They ran like frightened boys. Some jumped fences. Some bolted into the woods. Shoes flew from feet. Coats were discarded. Santo Trafficante, the Florida boss, slipped in mud and bruised his ribs. A capo from Chicago was found hiding under a neighbor's chicken coop. One man, John Montana, a respected don from Buffalo, simply stood by his Cadillac and claimed he was there to visit a sick friend. He was arrested anyway. Joseph Barbara tried to feign ignorance. He limped out of his own house, clutching his chest, claiming a relapse of his heart condition, but the troopers weren't buying it. The guest list alone betrayed him. They weren't old friends, they were old enemies, and yet they had all come. It wasn't a raid in the way Hollywood might have scripted. There were no gunshots, no glass breaking, no helicopters in the sky, just confusion, mud-stained pants, and the shattering of an illusion. These were not ghosts. They were not whispers. They were men, and the law had finally seen them. At the state police barracks in nearby Ovego, officers struggled to process the wave of arrests. The booking room, usually quiet, was overflowing with designer cufflinks and monogrammed wallets. Mobsters demanded lawyers. Some offered bribes, others offered silence. Most gave nothing, just names like Joe Smith or Tony White. But Croswell's notepad, filled over weeks of patient observation, told a different story. The press arrived quickly. Cameras flashed. Headlines bloomed across the country. By nightfall, Mafia meeting busted in upstate New York. The Associated Press ran the story in every major newspaper. Television anchors stumbled over Italian surnames as they read the list aloud. The American public, for the first time, saw the Mafia not as a rumor or a movie plot, but a structure, a network, an empire. J. Edgar Hoover, who for years had denied the Mafia's existence altogether, now stood publicly embarrassed. His silence was no longer sustainable. Congress asked for briefings. The FBI scrambled to respond. Back in Apalachin, silence returned slowly. The estate emptied. The lawn bore deep tire ruts. A single silk tie was found snagged on a pine branch at the edge of the woods, and in Joseph Barbara's living room, a folded napkin with the initials VG was found in the ashtray. Vito Genovese, the man who had orchestrated the meeting, the man who had tried to crown himself king, but kings are not made in the open. Not in front of flashbulbs. The aftermath was seismic. Some attendees were released due to lack of evidence. Others faced grand juries. Careers were derailed. Alliances broken. Genovese, once poised to lead La Cosa Nostra into a new era of centralized power, would soon face indictment on drug trafficking charges. He would spend the final years of his life in a prison cell, muttering about betrayal. Joseph Barbara died 2 years later. Heart failure. The empire he had hoped to host, the throne room he tried to build in his living room, collapsed into ridicule. His name would forever be tied not to power, but to exposure. And Apalachin, a town that had lived quietly for a century, became a symbol, a scar, a whispered cautionary tale in mob circles. Never gather too many men. Never wear your wealth in the woods. Never assume silence means safety. The raid did not destroy the Mafia, but it forced it to evolve. It scattered leadership, fractured families, and invited scrutiny that would culminate. Decades later, in RICO indictments, witness protection deals, and the unraveling of bloodlines once thought untouchable. And in that moment, captured forever in black and white news photos of fedora-clad men hiding their faces, of troopers gripping notebooks, of Cadillacs idling beside mud-streaked fields, something eternal changed. The Mafia was no longer a myth. It had a street address. It had fingerprints, it had a story, and it had just been caught in the act. Not in the alleys of Brooklyn or the docks of Jersey, but in the cold, quiet stillness of upstate New York, in the town of Apalachin on a Thursday morning. When silence shattered, it was the silence that fooled them. For decades, the American Mafia thrived beneath a hush so complete, even the highest seats of power chose not to hear. Murders happened, trucks vanished, judges were bribed, but somehow the narrative never cracked. Men were shot on the steps of courthouses, but the term organized crime remained missing from headlines. In Washington, J. Edgar Hoover stood at press podiums with calm certainty and declared it myth. "There is no Mafia," he said over and over, as if repetition could overwrite reality. But behind the newspaper ink and television glare, in the veins of America's great cities, a darker economy pulsed, quiet, structured, impenetrable, not chaos, order, an invisible order built on favors and fear, on blood and brotherhood. New York, Chicago, Detroit, Kansas City, Buffalo. Each city bore its own family, and each family answered to something higher. The Commission, formed in 1931, born from the bloodbath of the Castellamarese War, a commission was not a myth, it was the boardroom of the underworld, and by the 1950s it ran its empire like a multinational corporation, with silos of power, vertical integration, and ruthless quality control. In Brooklyn, Joe Profaci grew olive oil imports into a front for narcotics distribution. In Tampa, Santo Traficante built bridges to Havana that carried heroin under the scent of cigars. In Chicago, Sam Giancana pulled strings not only on the streets, but in union halls and ballot boxes. And in Manhattan, Vito Genovese, recently returned from exile, eyed the throne like a man born to reclaim it. But by 1957, the balance was trembling. Beneath the silence was friction, quiet wars, territories that bled into each other, old alliances strained by greed and modernity. Hushed meetings, signals passed between waiters in downtown restaurants. The bosses were uneasy. Genovese was making moves. Costello had barely survived a hit. Luciano's voice still echoed from Naples, but his grip had loosened. Some feared another war, others feared irrelevance, so the call went out. There must be a meeting, but this would not be like the old ones, not in a New York basement or a Jersey butcher shop. No, this had to be removed, remote, unseen, a gathering not of soldiers or lieutenants, but of leaders to mend fractures, to redraw borders, to decide the future. Joseph Barbara's estate in Apalachin was chosen not for its grandeur, but for its anonymity, a sleepy hilltop in upstate New York, the perfect stage for what they hoped would be an invisible summit. But the need for that meeting, the desperation that drove it, had been building for years. In Cuba, Meyer Lansky had cultivated a criminal paradise, casinos, brothels, and state-sanctioned profits. But with Batista's regime teetering, mob interests feared instability. Millions had been sunk into Havana's skyline. If the island fell, so would their money. In Las Vegas, the scam had become a science. Casinos like the Sands and the Flamingo didn't just serve tourists. They served the commission, skimmed cash. Millions, untouched by taxmen, was funneled east in suitcases. But the influx of attention, new blood, and syndicate tensions made the city a pressure cooker. Deals were made, then unmade. People disappeared, sometimes in desert pits, sometimes into federal custody. And back home, the streets were no longer just turf. They were arteries of power, control over a local union. The Teamsters, the longshoremen, meant control over shipping, construction, transit, and control over transit meant control over America's bones. This was not the Mafia of fedoras and switchblades anymore. It was a machine, elegant, profitable, paranoid still. J. Edgar Hoover refused to see it, despite mounting evidence, wiretaps, bodies, smuggled ledgers. The FBI's public stance was unchanged. There was no such thing as a nationwide criminal syndicate, no commission, no coordinated leadership. The murders, he claimed, were isolated, cultural, a misunderstanding of Italian customs. Privately, Hoover focused his bureau's energy on communists and radicals. Organized crime, he said, was a local matter, but the Mafia knew better, and that arrogance, that blind spot, allowed them to flourish. For now, in 1956, Vito Genovese made his final move, having muscled Frank Costello into semi-retirement with a bullet to the head. One that missed, but spoke volumes. Genovese now stood poised to take full control of the commission. But his ascent unsettled many. Carlo Gambino, ever the tactician, watched from the sidelines. Joe Bonanno, cautious and cerebral, remained aloof, and across the Atlantic Luciano seethed. Genovese's reach was growing, but his trust was shrinking. This instability, this swelling uncertainty, forced the families to reconsider how they did business. The world was changing. America was watching television now. Cameras were everywhere. Journalists didn't look away, and informants had become a new kind of currency. The Commission feared a repeat of the Castellamarese War, a bloody conflict that had once torn the Mafia in half. No one wanted that. Again, not in the age of microphones, not in a country whose press had begun to ask questions. So they came to an agreement. Apalachin would be a chance to breathe, to recalibrate, to avoid war by gathering, speaking, dividing the spoils like gentlemen, but no records would be kept, no cameras allowed, just handshakes and cigars, quiet understandings beneath pine trees. The symbolism mattered. To meet was to acknowledge they existed, not just to each other, but to the world. They were risking visibility, but the risk of silence had grown greater in this climate. Of ambition, fear, and the slow erosion of omerta, the meeting took shape. Invitations were extended, routes plotted, hotels booked under fake names, Cadillacs rented. The gears began to turn, and in the center of it all, unnoticed by most, was a simple man with a badge, Edgar Croswell. He didn't know the names, not yet, but he knew the pattern. Out-of-town guests, quiet driveways, full, hotel registries in a town that never filled. He paid attention. While Washington looked away, it was that tension between a world that refused to see and a world built on not being seen that made Apalachin inevitable. The Mafia needed to come together, but in doing so they risked being seen together. They weren't ready for that, and neither was America. He sat alone on his front porch, a thick wool blanket over his knees and a steaming cup of broth cupped in his hands as the early November wind whistled through the oaks. To anyone passing by, Joseph Barbara looked like just another aging businessman, nursing the remains of a heart attack. A man retreating from life, but inside his chest, beneath the weakness and gauze and pills, something still burned, a desperate flicker of relevance. They called him Joe the Barber, though it had been years since he touched scissors or rubbed a warm towel across a man's face. That name followed him from Brooklyn to Binghamton, from backroom hustles to bootlegging, and now here to the sleepy hilltop estate in Apalachin, New York. He'd traded razors for real estate, gambling halls for cattle barns, yet in his mind, he hadn't left the life, not really. He'd just risen in it. Barbara was a contradiction. In wool socks, he liked his lawn trimmed just right, his coffee black, his guests punctual. He read the paper every morning, clipping out articles on city corruption and federal overreach, but most of all, he liked being seen as important. If not by the world, then by the men who lived in its shadows. By 1957, his health was in rapid decline. His doctor warned him not to strain, not to climb stairs, not to host anything more demanding than a bridge night. But Barbara had other ideas. His house, a spacious colonial with 14 rooms and a long drive, wasn't just a retreat. It was his monument, his proof that he still mattered. And when word reached him that the commission was planning a national gathering, he made his pitch. Let them come to him. He'd host the bosses, feed them, shield them, offer them a refuge in the forest. No FBI, no microphones, just pine trees, cigars, and peace. It was, to him, an honor, a gesture of loyalty, but also deep. Down, a cry for recognition. Barbara's estate had been used before, quietly, unofficially as a meeting place. The Buffalo faction, led by his old friend Stefano Magaddino, often sat men down for informal discussions. Barbara had known Magaddino since the early days when the Buffalo boss ruled his territory with iron ritual and Sicilian stoicism. Magaddino trusted Barbara, not with secrets, perhaps, but with logistics, with hospitality. That was Barbara's strength. He wasn't feared, he was tolerated, useful. But there was another element to the decision, one that Barbara never voiced, but that hummed beneath everything he did. He wanted to be remembered. The Mafia, after all, was not just a business, it was legacy. And Barbara, watching his body deteriorate and his relevance slip, believed that hosting this summit might cement his place in the grand narrative. Let the others wage war over Las Vegas and Havana. He would offer them sanctuary. He would be the man who kept the peace, who gathered the empire beneath one roof. But the roof, it turned out, had cracks. The butler, an anxious man named Dominic, had never liked the crowds. He smoked too much when important guests arrived, wrung his hands when Cadillacs rolled up the gravel drive, and when Barbara mentioned the size of this gathering, Dominic's nerves began to fray. He asked questions he wasn't supposed to ask. He noticed patterns, and when the grocery order arrived, meats for 60 men, crates of imported wines, he made an offhand comment to the delivery man at the butcher shop in nearby Endicott. That butcher, a man with a watchful eye and a steady routine, remembered the detail. He remembered, too, the black cars and unfamiliar faces that had begun appearing at the Esquire Motel across town. Cars with New Jersey plates, men who wore overcoats like uniforms. It didn't add up, and it didn't feel local. The butcher told a friend. The friend had a cousin. That cousin, by strange and fateful chance, was Edgar Croswell, the same state trooper who had long been suspicious of Barbara's home and his seemingly endless parade of guests. But Joseph Barber didn't know that yet. He was focused on menus, seating, fresh linens. He told his wife to make the best roast she could. He walked the property slowly, leaning on a cane, instructing his groundskeeper where to park the cars when they came. He wanted order, clean lines. He wanted it to look dignified, not like a crime summit, but a business retreat, a council of elders. He didn't see the trap forming around him. He saw a legacy blooming, and others encouraged that illusion. Magaddino, ever the old world strategist, had no problem letting Barbara take center stage. The heat, if it came, wouldn't land in Buffalo. It would land in Apalachin, and so Magaddino nodded, approved, sent out the word. Barbara would host. The commission would meet. Let the man have his glory. By early November, the coals had gone out. The wheels were in motion. Mobsters across the country prepared for travel. Some by car, some by train, a few by private plane. Pseudonyms were used. Wives were lied to, but no one said no. This was history. And when history calls, you answer. Barbara arranged everything. He rented extra silverware from a hotel banquet hall 20 miles away. His butler was nearly catatonic with anxiety. But Barbara pressed on. He didn't notice the cracks, or maybe he did, and chose to ignore them. The morning of November 14, 1957 began like any other. Barbara rose early, dressed slowly, and made his way downstairs with help from his wife. The sky was overcast, the wind light. By 9 a.m. the first guests were arriving. The gravel popped beneath their tires. The butler flinched at every engine. Inside the house, the scent of garlic and roasted meats began to fill the air. Men shook hands in silence. Some hadn't seen each other in years. Others had nearly killed each other. But here, in Barbara's home, there was a code. No violence, no disputes, only business. Barbara watched them all from his armchair, a thin sheen of sweat clinging to his forehead. He was exhausted already, but he was also proud. He had done it. They were here. The empire had come to his door. What he didn't know was that Croswell had already taken up position, that a surveillance team had eyes on the property, that the butcher's tip had lit a fuse. The troopers weren't sure what they were seeing, but they knew it wasn't normal, and that was enough. By the time the raid began, it was too late to hide. Cadillacs fled the driveway in every direction. Men bolted through hedges, disappeared into woods. Coats were abandoned, shoes lost. Barbara stood frozen in his living room, watching the storm he had unknowingly summoned swallow everything around him. He tried to explain, claimed it was just a barbecue, that he was recovering, that these men were friends. But no one believed him. His health collapsed soon after. The raid broke him not just physically, but spiritually. The men he tried to impress would never trust him again. Some blamed him, others mocked him. Even Magaddino kept his distance. And the FBI, finally forced to acknowledge the Mafia's existence, would use Apalachin as a battering ram against the entire underworld. Barbara had wanted to be remembered, and he would be, but not as a statesman, as a symbol, a cautionary tale. About ambition outpacing discretion, about the quiet man who tried to play host to giants and ended up a footnote in their fall. He died 2 years later, heart failure, buried without honors, and yet in that final gathering, in the roast he ordered, the chairs he arranged, the paths he swept, lay a man's longing to be seen. Not feared, not worshipped, just seen, and in the end, the world saw him, just not the way he hoped. He sat beneath a wall of saints, their painted eyes watching him with glassy stillness. A rosary dangled from one hand, but the other held a letter. Soaked in ambition, Naples, 1945, American troops patrolled the streets outside. But inside the villa, Vito Genovese plotted his return. He had been gone too long, 6 years in exile, 6 years surrounded by broken statues and fascist generals. But exile had not softened him. It had sharpened his hunger. America still pulsed. In his mind, the 5 boroughs, the rackets, the loyalty he believed still flickered beneath the ash. While Lucky Luciano was building alliances from a prison cell and Frank Costello was basking in political influence, Vito Genovese was biding time, nursing grudges like old scars. He wanted it all back, not as an ally, but as a king, by the Sti Soldi. Time he stepped off the boat in New York in 1946, the skyline looked different. The war had changed everything. The streets were still crooked, but now more crowded. The stakes were higher, money flowed faster. Narcotics were becoming the new bloodline of organized crime, and Vito, ever the pragmatist, saw it for what it was. A throne no one had claimed. He had come home not to blend in, but to take over. Vito Genovese had always been an enigma. Among the 5 families, short, thick-necked, with a stare that seemed carved from marble, he spoke softly, rarely smiled, and carried the silence of a man who measured every word like a blade. He didn't boast, he calculated, born in 1897 in Naples, Genovese came to America as a child, raised in the tenements of Manhattan's Lower East Side. By his early teens, he was running errands for gangsters. By 20, he was feared. He had blood on his hands before most men had learned how to shave. But it was his mind, his cold, mechanical way of viewing the world, that set him apart. He didn't love violence, but he understood its necessity, and in 1957, violence would become his language. When Genovese returned to New York, he found the world he once ruled now reshaped by Luciano and Costello. Luciano, though in exile, still held enormous sway. Costello, known as the Prime Minister, ruled the Luciano family through charm, diplomacy, and deep political connections. He was seen in courtrooms and private clubs, a gangster in tailored suits, shaking hands with senators. Genovese found that kind of visibility offensive. To him, power wasn't about charm, it was about control, so he moved in shadows, slowly, quietly. He began chipping away at Costello's alliances. He made overtures to underbosses, offered protection to soldiers who felt abandoned. He whispered promises in the right ears, threats in the wrong ones, and all the while he expanded his narcotics empire, trafficking heroin through Sicily, Cuba, and Harlem, washing the profits in legitimate businesses that smelled of fresh paint and false invoices. In 1951, Genovese made his first open move. He had Willie Moretti, Costello's loyal lieutenant, assassinated. Moretti had grown too loud, too unhinged, too public, but more importantly, he was in the way. Then came the attempt on Costello himself, May 2nd, 1957. Frank Costello was entering the lobby of his apartment building on Central Park West. As he turned the corner, a shot rang out. It grazed his head, missed killing him by inches. The shooter fled. Costello survived. But the message had been sent. When police asked who tried to kill him, Costello gave the famous reply, "I couldn't. See, I didn't get a look." But everyone knew it was Genovese. And Genovese got what he wanted. Costello stepped down as boss. It was bloodless, but only on paper. Vito Genovese was now in control. And it wasn't just about the family. He wanted the commission. He wanted the seat Luciano had once crafted. But without Luciano's charm or Costello's diplomacy, he wanted obedience, total, unquestioned. But Genovese's assent created ripples. Not all the families trusted him. Some saw him as crude. Others feared his obsession with drugs. Narcotics had always been a taboo. Profitable, yes, but dangerous. The kind of heat that brought headlines and informants. But Genovese didn't care. The money was too great. A kilo of heroin could be bought for $1,000 and sold for over $100,000 on the street. In an empire built on numbers, that math was irresistible. Still, the old guard resisted. So Genovese made a move, one that would either solidify his power or destroy him. He demanded a meeting. Not just a meeting, a gathering, a national summit. Every boss, every capo, every power broker from New York to Los Angeles, from Tampa to Detroit. A meeting to affirm his authority, to make it official, to silence the whispers. He pitched it as diplomacy, but it was coronation. And he chose Joseph Barber's estate in Apalachin as the venue, remote, quiet, safe, or so it seemed. Behind the scenes, Genovese was already reordering. The board, he tightened his grip on Harlem's heroin markets. He forced loyalty pledges from hesitant allies. He sanctioned quiet killings of those who questioned him. The commission, once built to balance power, was tilting in his favor. To the men attending Apalachin, the message was clear. Come or risk becoming irrelevant. Carlo Gambino came, cautious, calculating. Joe Profaci came. So did Sam Giancana, Paul Castellano, Santo Trafficante. They arrived not just to talk business, but to see if Genovese could be stopped. What they didn't know What Genovese didn't know was that a storm was forming around them, because outside the compound of crime, the world was starting to wake up. The FBI, forced by media pressure to acknowledge organized crime, had begun to turn their gaze. State troopers like Edgar Croswell were gathering names, license plates, patterns. The illusion of invisibility was fading, and Genovese, in his hunger, had made a fatal mistake. He brought too many together. The raid on Apalachin shattered the myth. Dozens arrested, photographed, questioned. The front pages told a story no one could deny. America now saw the Mafia, and they saw Genovese, not as a hidden hand, but as the man trying to sit at the top of the pyramid. He had demanded recognition, and he got it, but not in the way he intended. The fallout came fast. The FBI turned its full force toward narcotics. Informants emerged, the public outcry fed political will, and Genovese, once untouchable, became a name on a list. In 1959, he was indicted for heroin trafficking. Prosecutors built the case on wiretaps and testimony from inside the mob. Genovese claimed innocence, but the walls were closing in. He was convicted and sentenced to 15 years in Atlanta Federal Penitentiary. There, in a cell far from the world he tried to dominate, he spent the rest of his life planning, writing, brooding, watching as the empire he tried to command continued without him. He died in prison in 1969. No fanfare, no headlines, just a thin obituary. A quiet end to a man who tried to become more than feared, who wanted to be obeyed. But Vito Genovese left a mark, not in bloodlines, not in film, not in legend. His enforcers were shadows too. Kevin Weeks, broad-shouldered, brutal, loyal, a former bouncer turned collector. Kevin didn't need to talk much. His fists did enough. Stephen, the rifleman, phlegmy, older, slicker, colder, a man with roots in the Italian mob, but loyalty sealed to Whitey by a shared appetite for secrecy and violence. Where Whitey strategized, Flemmy executed. If you crossed them, the outcome was consistent, fast, final, and quiet. Some victims were shot, others were strangled. Some were dismembered in basements with tarps and silence. A few were buried beneath bridges, others dissolved in lime, their names erased like chalk in rain. No one ever found a note. No threats were made. One day a man would speak out. The next, he'd stop showing up. That was the message. In the bars along L Street and the old bowling alley near West Broadway, men whispered warnings like scripture. Don't say his name. Don't ask questions. Just pay your cut. Whitey wasn't feared because of what he did. He was feared because of what he might do. Even the police played by his rules, some out of fear, some out of greed. He had a system, a balance. He kept Southie clean on the surface. There were no shootouts on corners, no turf wars in the streets. He didn't like noise, and he made sure the neighborhood stayed quiet enough to seem safe. If a crew from Charlestown came sniffing around, they were warned once. If they came again, they didn't leave. If someone sold heroin, Whitey made an example of them. Not because he was morally opposed to drugs. He ran cocaine and marijuana through the city like blood through a vein, but because heroin made addicts loud, unpredictable, vulnerable, and vulnerability attracted law enforcement. Whitey didn't tolerate vulnerability. He ran things like a businessman with a ghost's touch. He paid informants well, kept his network wide. When a cop got too curious, a favor was called in. When a journalist started asking questions, a relative received a visit, not a threat, just a conversation, just enough to make the story disappear. He understood the psychology of power better than most politicians. You didn't need to control everything, you just needed people to believe you did. But beneath that exterior, beneath the cold eyes and the modest jacket, was a man consumed by control. He trusted no one, He carried a scanner in his car that tracked police dispatch. He rotated safe houses, rarely sleeping in the same bed, too. Nights in a row, he parked blocks away from meetings, walked through alleys, checked reflections in store windows. He wiped down phones, burned notes, spoke in code even to people who already knew what he meant. Every encounter was a test. Every silence a threat. Whitey believed everyone had a weakness, and most had a price. He simply made sure he got there before anyone else. One winter night in 1982, a low-level bookmaker named Brian Halloran came to Whitey with a problem. Halloran had been arrested on a drug charge and feared someone in his crew was talking. He wanted help protection. Whitey nodded, listened, said he'd look into it. Halloran left relieved. 2 weeks later, he was gunned down in a hail of bullets outside a seafood restaurant. His associate, Michael Donahue, an innocent man, giving him a ride, was killed, too. The message was clear. Even asking for help could be a betrayal. That same night, Whitey attended a wake, quietly paid his respects, said nothing. In Southie, the myth only grew. To some, he was a necessary evil, a guardian who kept outside gangs from taking over, an Irish Robin Hood who bought Thanksgiving turkeys for poor families, handed out cash to widows, helped old women cross the street. To others, he was something else, entirely a cancer hiding beneath the skin of a neighborhood that didn't know how to fight back. He didn't see himself as a villain. He believed he was playing the long game, protecting the community from the Italians, the junkies, the feds, that the violence he used was surgical, justified, even noble in a brutal kind of way, but the truth was simpler. Whitey Bulger wasn't a gangster. He was an ecosystem, and the city adapted around him. The FBI files remained clean. John Conley continued to run interference. Prosecutors stalled. Cases crumbled. Every time it seemed the walls might close in, someone somewhere leaned on the right door. Whitey called it insurance. He kept everything compartmentalized. No one. Man knew too much, and if they started getting close, they didn't stay long. He didn't talk. He didn't write. He vanished before you even knew he was there. One of his most trusted associates once said, "You could sit across from Whitey for an hour, and when you left, you weren't sure if he liked you, hated you, or was planning to kill you. That was the point. He wasn't meant to be understood. He was meant to be felt, like a storm on the horizon, or the quiet just before a door creaks." Opened by 1985, his influence stretched far beyond Boston. Money laundered through Florida real estate. Guns shipped to Irish rebels. Political strings pulled quietly in local races. He met with arms dealers, corrupt unions, and even dabbled in the race-fixing schemes left behind by the old Winter Hill operators. But he never bragged, never once boasted. He knew the moment you heard yourself speak too loudly was the moment you became visible, and visibility, in Whitey's world, was death. Still, the fog that had once protected him was beginning to thin. Technology advanced. Surveillance improved. Allies got sloppy. Younger gangsters less careful. More arrogant started making noise, and beneath it all, a growing tension simmered. The people of Boston had grown used to the silence, but they were starting to wonder what it cost and how long it could hold. But for now, the phantom still ruled. No headlines, no mugshots, no trials, just the echo of footsteps on wet pavement, and the knowledge that somewhere in that fog, someone was watching and deciding who lived and who didn't. On the third floor of the Massachusetts State House, past the polished oak banisters and the marble corridors humming with the footsteps of lobbyists and staffers, sat an office that belonged to the most powerful man in state politics. The door was marked simply, William M. Bulger, President. Of the Senate inside, books lined the shelves, Plato, Cicero, Jefferson. Framed photographs hung precisely classical symphonies, childhood smiles, ribbon cuttings, the light from the windows washed over mahogany furniture, and the soft gold of a flag in the corner. It was a room designed to command respect, and yet, beneath that carefully composed stillness there was a shadow. It didn't speak. It didn't write memos. It simply existed, and it bore the name of James Whitey Bulger. Billy and Whitey were born just 15 months apart. Two sons of South Boston, two branches from the same gnarled tree, but the paths they took diverged. Early and visibly, Billy, the bookish one, quiet, devout, inquisitive, he stayed in school, listened to their mother, showed up to church in polished shoes and a pressed collar. While Whitey roamed the streets with the Shamrocks, Billy studied Latin. While Whitey ran numbers, Billy recited poetry. They shared the same kitchen, the same freezing winters, the same father's broken voice. But by the late 1950s, their lives were split by concrete and conviction, one rising through the institutions of government, the other falling deeper into the underworld still. The blood between them never thinned. As Billy ascended the political ranks, first as a state representative, then as state senator, and eventually as Senate president by 1978, Whitey was rising too, in his own darker domain, and in Southie they called them both Mr. Bulger, one in the Capitol, one in the streets. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, but no one dared speak it aloud. Billy was the model of Irish Catholic ambition, he quoted Aristotle from memory, wrote essays on the meaning of justice, and lobbied for public libraries. He was beloved by constituents who saw him as the proof that one of their own could rise without selling out. He kept his speech deliberate, his humor dry. He read poetry on the Senate floor. He avoided scandal, embraced ceremony, and never once used foul language in public. But outside the chamber walls, questions loomed. How did someone so clean come? From a family so haunted? And what did he know? What could he have known about the crimes his brother was orchestrating from the shadows of South Boston? Billy maintained one position, always. He was loyal to family, but he knew nothing of Whitey's world. They were close, yes. They spoke regularly, yes. But he had no involvement in James's life. That line became his armor, and for decades no one could pierce it. In truth, there was no evidence, no bank accounts, no wiretaps, no meetings caught on tape, just whispers. Whispers that Billy visited their childhood apartment long after he had moved uptown. Whispers that his name came up in certain conversations behind closed doors, but nothing ever stuck. He remained untouched, and that was the power. Whitey never asked Billy for favors. That was the rule. He didn't need legislative help or political introductions. What he needed was something quieter, something no one could give but a brother. Distance, the image of innocence, the illusion of separation. As long as Billy existed in the world of clean politics, speaking at Harvard, attending Mass, shaking hands with governors, then Whitey, by contrast, could remain invisible. If someone questioned the Bulger name, there was always a respectable face attached to it. Their phone calls became a ritual. Once a week, no longer than 10 minutes, never recorded, always indirect. Billy spoke of family, his wife, his children, local politics. Whitey listened, then hung up sometimes. Croswell gathered a handful of troopers, no more than a dozen, and briefed them with quiet urgency. No FBI, no warrants, just instincts and a long memory. Their job wasn't to kick down doors. Not yet. Their job was to watch, to see who came, to record what no one else was willing to see. They split up. Marked cars were posted at intersections. Officers were placed along the winding drive that led to Barbara's estate. One man waited near the tree line with binoculars, watching. The Cadillacs roll in. The troopers kept their distance, no sirens, no radios, Just cold breath in the morning air and the sound of engines slipping over gravel. Inside the house, the Mafia gathered, completely unaware. But outside, Croswell watched the puzzle fall into place. It was like clockwork. Plates from Chicago, Florida, New Jersey, men in long coats and slick shoes, stepping from cars with briefcases. This wasn't a backyard barbecue. It was a summit, a council of war, and Croswell, in that moment, understood the scale of what he was seeing. He had no backup from the Bureau, no support from higher offices, but he had evidence, and he had his conviction. Around 12:30 p.m., he made the call. It wasn't an order, it was a judgment, a choice, too. Act to stop watching and intervene. The officers moved quietly. They fanned out, blocking driveways and parking exits. They approached the house not with guns drawn, but with firm purpose, enough to unnerve, enough to scatter, and scatter they did. Inside, someone must have spotted the troopers through a window, or maybe word spread like smoke. In seconds, the illusion of calm shattered. Suits and coats exploded into motion. Doors slammed, voices rose, and then came the flight. Dozens of mobsters, some in fedoras, some in $300 shoes, bolted through hedgerows and sprinted into the woods like deer. Flushed from cover, the scene turned chaotic. A boss from Buffalo twisted his ankle on a tree root. A Chicago capo dove into a ditch to avoid detection. Santo Trafficante ran until his lungs gave out. It was unthinkable. Men who had ordered assassinations, controlled rackets, bribed mayors, reduced to muddy silhouettes scrambling through cold. Fields no longer invisible, no longer legends, just men. Croswell and his team began making arrests. They asked for names, got lies. Joe Smith, Mike Brown. I'm here for lunch, but Croswell's notebook said otherwise. He had plates, he had hotel logs, he had weeks of surveillance, now paid off in a single afternoon. 62 men were detained. Among them were some of the most feared figures in American organized crime. Not low-level soldiers, not freelancers, but bosses, underbosses, fixers, the very infrastructure of the Mafia. They were processed at the local barracks in Alvigo, one by one. A room meant for petty criminals and drunken disputes now held the architects of the American underworld. They filled out forms with false names, denied everything, but their presence said enough. The news traveled fast. By the next morning, newspapers were running the story. Mafia meeting busted, big-time gangsters caught in New York. For decades, the Mafia had been a whisper, a Hollywood myth, something that happened in alleys, not boardrooms, but now it had a location, a date, a police report, and all because a butcher made a comment. And Edgar Croswell listened. It didn't take long for the blowback to start. In Washington, J. Edgar Hoover scrambled. The Bureau had been caught flat-footed. For years, Hoover had refused to acknowledge the Mafia's existence, dismissing it as immigrant folklore. But Apalachin made that position impossible. There were photos now, mugshots, evidence, a map of connections no press conference could deny. Croswell didn't seek the spotlight, but he got it anyway. He was interviewed, profiled, even mocked by some, called a lucky hick, an overzealous small-town cop. But others knew the truth. He had changed history with a notepad, a hunch, and a refusal to ignore the obvious. Edgar Croswell had torn a hole in the fabric of organized crime. He hadn't dismantled it, but he'd revealed it, and from that day on, the Mafia would never again be able to pretend it wasn't real. Croswell's legacy is rarely mentioned in Hollywood. Scripps. He's not a household name, but in the annals of criminal justice, he is a monument to what one man's resolve can accomplish. He didn't wear a suit, didn't make speeches, but he saw what others refused to see, and when the moment came, he Didn't blink, he acted, and in doing so, changed everything. It began as a still morning, the kind where breath hangs visibly in the air, and even the trees seem to wait. But just after noon, something cracked, a glimpse through a lace curtain, a uniform caught between branches. A whispered warning passed from the foyer to the kitchen, and suddenly the quiet hills of Apalachin became a theater of panic. The Mafia, for a brief moment in American history, forgot how to disappear. Men who had once orchestrated assassinations in silence, who'd built rackets, bribed senators, and carved empires from fear, now scrambled like startled deer through mud and bramble, their $1,000 shoes sinking into wet leaves, their tailored wool coats snagging on pine limbs. The moment the troopers began moving in, chaos swallowed. The estate, Santo Traficante Jr., once the polished kingmaker of Tampa and Havana, took a running leap over a stone wall, landed crooked, and disappeared into the trees. Behind him, Frank DeSimone of Los Angeles tripped in the driveway gravel, ripping the cuff of his pinstripe pants as he clawed his way to the road. Carlo Gambino, master of whispers and long games, ducked low behind a hedge, his eyes scanning for an exit like a hunted animal. Hats flew, cufflinks loosened. Some tried to flee on foot, darting into fields like schoolboys caught sneaking cigarettes. Others tried to talk their way out, standing stiff before troopers, insisting they were there for a barbecue, for a sick friend, for business discussions unrelated to crime. None of it held. One man was found crouched behind a chicken coop, shivering in silence, his dress shoes caked in mud. Another had ripped his trouser leg fleeing into the woods and limped back to the house, pretending he'd simply gone for a walk. But there was no walking away from this. The troopers, outnumbered but unfazed, moved with precision. They weren't rough. They didn't need to be. The fear was already written across the faces of the men they approached. Not fear of arrest, but fear of exposure, fear of the flashbulb, fear of being seen. Because this wasn't New York, where palms could be greased and questions dropped. This was rural New York, state police jurisdiction, and they weren't used to being told what not to look at. Soon, the estate grounds looked like the aftermath of a storm. Scattered hats, abandoned cigars, deep tire ruts across the once pristine lawn. One silk tie, torn and sodden, was found clinging to a pine branch, the only trace of a man who had vanished into the woods. And then came the image that would burn itself into the American imagination. Dozens of men in suits, some sweaty, some muddy, all silent, crammed into a small town jailhouse. Waiting to be processed, the booking desk at the Ovego barracks, designed for local drunks and traffic citations, now bore the weight of lay Cosa Nostra. They gave names like John Doe, Tony Green, Michael Thomas. Some refused to speak. Others tried to call lawyers. One demanded a priest. A few tried to smile. Most did not. One man, when asked why he had been at Joseph Barber's house, replied flatly, "I was visiting a friend." "Who's the friend?" The trooper asked. The man blinked. "I forgot his name." Another claimed to be a kitchen appliance salesman. Another said he was looking at property. Another simply muttered, "No English," in an accent unmistakably from the Bronx Crosswell. Silent but steady, stood in the corner with his notebook, watching them crumble, not from interrogation, from the weight of being caught in that cramped room. The illusion died, not just for the Mafia, but for America. For decades, the myth of the Mafia had been convenient, deniable. Men like Hoover had clung to the fantasy that crime was local, disorganized, cultural, that there were no godfathers, no nationwide network of suits pulling invisible strings. But now, here they were, side by side, shoulder to shoulder, in a rural police station with fluorescent lights humming overhead. Frank DeSimone, Joe Magliocco, Russell Bufalino, some trying to look invisible. others staring at the floor, and outside the reporters were already gathering. News of the arrests spread like fire. By the next day, front pages screamed headlines America had never seen before. Mafia summit busted in Apalachin. Top crime figures flee police raid. Who are these men? The photographs. Men in overcoats looking away from the camera, shielding their faces with hat brims, struck a nerve with the public. These weren't movie gangsters. These were real. And they had names. And they had faces. And they had come together. That, more than anything, was the damage for decades. The Mafia's strength had been its fragmentation, the idea that no one person, no single room, could capture it all. But now the truth was undeniable. They were connected. The bosses of Chicago, New York, California, Florida, they had converged in one place at one time for one purpose, and they'd been caught. The press turned the story into legend. Television anchors fumbled through Italian surnames as they listed the detained men. Senators demanded answers from Hoover. Law enforcement agencies scrambled to explain how one state trooper had uncovered what the Bureau had missed for years. Behind the walls of organized crime, panic set in. Who talked? Who gave the address? Who failed to notice the troopers? Paranoia spread like rot. The families turned inwards. Some alliances broke. Others tightened with new desperation. Genovese, who had demanded the meeting, now found himself exposed, a would-be king with mud on his shoes and the press at his door. Apalachin didn't kill the Mafia, but it wounded the illusion of its invincibility. It showed the world that crime, even the most disciplined, ritualized, revered form of it, could panic, could run, could bleed, and all it took was a few uniforms, a forest, and a silence too loud to ignore. The ink dried fast. By dawn on November 15th, 1957, the presses were already spinning in every major newsroom across the United States. Linotypes clattered, headlines screamed. Photographers rushed wet prints from the darkroom to the front page. And for the first time in American history, the word Mafia didn't feel like fiction. It felt like news. Mafia summit busted in upstate New York. Mob leaders flee police raid. Police capture crime bigs at secret meet. In New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles, readers rubbed their eyes and stared at something they'd never seen before. Dozens of high-ranking mobsters, real men, real names, real faces, photographed in handcuffs and damp trench coats, crowded into a rural police station like suspects from a carnival heist. But this was no sideshow. It was the underworld laid bare. The images felt impossible. These weren't mugshots from city vice squads or grainy photos snapped from behind tinted windshields. These were men in $500 suits, neckties torn, hair slicked, back with rain and sweat, being marched across gravel lots and fingerprinted under humming fluorescent lights, and suddenly everyone was paying attention. The Associated Press wire carried the story to every corner of the country. And then, across the Atlantic, in London, Paris, and Rome, international dailies ran headlines about America's criminal parliament. Cartoonists drew caricatures of fedora-wearing mobsters hopping fences in the woods. Talk radio buzzed. Morning shows speculated. The word Mafia, once whispered, now rolled off anchors' tongues with ease. And in Washington, D.C., the silence was deafening. At FBI headquarters, J. Edgar Hoover sat behind his massive mahogany desk, staring at the headlines with tightly pressed lips. For over 2 decades, he had publicly denied the existence of a centralized organized crime syndicate in America. To Hoover, crime was a local issue, a city problem, not a national conspiracy. He had spent years chasing communists and radicals. He had posed for photographs with Hollywood actors and paraded agents as modern cowboys. But the Mafia? That had been too inconvenient, too tangled, too difficult to control. Now he was cornered by truth. Editorials across the country turned their typewriters on the bureau. Where was the FBI? The raid that proved Hoover wrong in New York? Journalists uncovered the names of arrested men and traced their criminal empires across decades. In Chicago, reporters pieced together networks of influence, racketeering, and drug trafficking, all tied to men detained in a single sweep. Apalachin had not just exposed criminals, it had exposed connections for years. The American public had consumed mob stories like myth, bootleggers in the Roaring Twenties, the Valentine's Day Massacre. Hollywood had given them shadows. Black and white fictions that felt safe, stylized, distant. But this was different. This was real. The man next to you on the subway might be a boss. The local grocer's cousin might be on the list. The union rep who spoke so eloquently at City Hall might have fled through the Appalachian pines in Italian leather shoes. The effect was electric. Magazine covers began appearing with composite sketches of crime families. Map spreads detailed the 5 families of New York, complete with suspected territories and bosses. Life, Time, the New York Times, the Saturday Evening Post, all scrambled to profile men like Vito Genovese, Joe Profaci, and Santo Trafficante. Their names were no longer secrets, they were syllables of fear. And something shifted deep in the public consciousness. Crime was no longer a loose thread on the city's edge. It was a system coordinated, deliberate, and nationwide. What had once seemed like isolated violence, a barroom hit here, a casino, dispute there, now looked like symptoms of something bigger. A hidden infrastructure, a secret boardroom. Apalachin had cracked the glass. In the days that followed, state and federal investigators were flooded with tips. Legislators demanded new hearings. Hoover, now facing a credibility crisis, ordered an internal reorganization. He launched what would become one of the most aggressive surveillance campaigns in bureau history, planting wiretaps, flipping informants, and quietly assembling files that would later feed the RICO cases of the 1970s. But in those early days, the damage was done. The Mafia could no longer operate under the veil of public denial. Its leaders, once ghosts, were now figures named, photographed, printed, and worse, mocked. Cartoons in national papers portrayed gangsters as bumbling men with spaghetti-stained shirts fleeing into bushes. Late-night radio hosts joked about mobsters tripping over chicken wire. Columnists speculated about which boss had lost his hat, who had cried during booking, which one had tried to bribe a trooper with a $50 bill and a wink. It wasn't just exposure, it was humiliation. The veil had been pulled back, and behind it were not untouchable legends, but panicked men caught mid-flight, their dignity scattered across a rain-soaked lawn. Apalachin was never meant to be known. It was supposed to be a meeting of kings, held in the quiet of the countryside, away from the eyes of the world. A summit where power could be reaffirmed and empire could be mapped without consequence. Instead, it became a mirror, one they couldn't control, and for America, it became something else entirely, a reckoning, because once you see power raw and exposed, you never unsee it in New York. Winter came early that year, not in snow, but in silence. Cold glances, quiet phone lines, meetings that no longer happened. Trust, once traded like currency between the boroughs, had frozen in place. The events in Apalachin had rippled outward like a detonation beneath calm water. And in its wake, the 5 families of New York found themselves exposed, shaken, and worse, uncertain. No one felt the blow harder than Vito Genovese. He had engineered the summit as a coronation, his moment to unify the commission under his control, but instead of triumph, he walked away humiliated. Newspapers didn't call him boss. They called him the man who ran. Photos captured him unshaven and furious, coat askew, eyes full of fury. Not dominance. For a man who had clawed his way through blood and exile to sit on a throne, this was a public collapse. In the weeks that followed, Genovese retreated behind doors and silence. The men beneath him still obeyed, but something had changed. Whispers filled restaurants in Little Italy, traveled in folded notes across poker tables in the Bronx. He had brought heat, and the heat burned indiscriminately. Federal agents began knocking on doors that hadn't seen badges in years, surveillance. Vans appeared outside bakeries. Wives asked questions they'd never asked before. The line between life and legend, between protected and vulnerable, had thinned, and in that confusion Frank Koslow smiled. Koslow had kept his distance from Apalachin. After the botched hit that nearly ended his life earlier that year, a bullet that whispered Genovese's name, Koslow had stepped down, but not away. He still had contacts. He still had influence. And now, watching the man who tried to erase him stumble through press humiliation and federal attention, he allowed himself a quiet, almost surgical satisfaction. It wasn't revenge. Koslow didn't need revenge. He needed patience. But the man who moved like smoke through Manhattan's political circles knew better than to step forward again. He'd played chess, not checkers, and Apalachin had tilted the board. The one who did step forward was Carlo Gambino. He had attended the meeting in quiet obedience, eyes down, voice soft. But in the days that followed, Gambino's vision sharpened. He saw what the others couldn't or wouldn't, that chaos was opportunity. With Genovese exposed and Koslow silent, Gambino began building, quietly, no headlines, no grand gestures, just a phone call here, a whisper there. He started forming new allegiances, with soldiers who felt abandoned, with capos who feared Genovese's recklessness. Gambino didn't speak against Genovese. That wasn't his style. Instead, he positioned himself as the solution to disorder, the man who could restore what had been fractured. And slowly, men began to pivot. They had seen enough of crowns that gleamed too brightly. They were ready for shadows again. Elsewhere in New York, the other families reacted with suspicion. Joe Bonanno, head of the Bonanno family, didn't attend Apalachin. Whether by foresight or arrogance, he had chosen absence, and that absence became armor. While others faced subpoenas and scrutiny, Bonanno stayed insulated. For now, but he too saw the change. He began reshaping his operations, tightening control, reducing exposure, and he began watching Gambino very closely, because power in the Mafia never vanishes. It only changes hands. Joe Profaci, the head of his namesake family, emerged wounded. He had been arrested at the meeting, questioned, photographed. The press called him a drug dealer, dressed like a priest. Profaci, deeply religious and deeply cruel, was shaken by the mockery. He retreated into paranoia, cracking down on internal dissent. His generosity, already thin, vanished, and beneath him, rebellion began to brew. The commission itself changed. Before Apalachin, it had been visible in its invisibility, a known secret, a structure whispered through city blocks and funeral parlors, but now it was something else, something damaged. No longer a place for meetings, no longer a body of balance. It became an idea, silent, mobile, harder to trace. Communications tightened. Names were no longer spoken, only signaled. Paper trails vanished. Legitimate businesses became the front lines of a new kind of order. Apalachin had taught them a lesson. Visibility was death, and so the Mafia returned to its roots. Not in numbers, but in ritual. Not in growth, but in control. The flash had failed them. Now they would embrace the fog, but the fear didn't fade. Federal agents, emboldened by public attention, began crawling into the cracks. Investigations that had sat cold for years were revived. Rackets were busted. Informants, once unthinkable, began to appear, their loyalty undone. By fear or prison or betrayal, the Mafia's myth had been broken, and in New York, that break was felt on every level. From the rooftop card games of Bensonhurst to the bookmaking parlors of East Harlem, the unspoken rules had shifted. Less trust, less movement, more watching, because the eyes were now everywhere. Apalachin hadn't ended the Mafia, but it forced a new version of it to be born. One colder, sharper, paranoid, calculating, and in the smoke-filled backrooms of the city, men like Carlo Gambino began drawing new lines, not on maps, but in hearts, in trust, and eventually in blood. Wasn't guilt that moved J. Edgar Hoover. It was shame the morning after the Apalachin raid. Newspapers lined newsstands across the country like a public indictment. Mafia summit raided, they read. Police nab dozens at upstate meeting. Names were listed, photos printed, networks exposed, and on every page, one question lingered like smoke. Where was the FBI? Hoover had built his legacy on certainty, on the image of control. His agents wore suits sharper than gangsters and marched with moral clarity. For decades, he had presented the Bureau as an impenetrable force against domestic threats, communists, radicals, kidnappers. But the Mafia? That had always been too messy, too ethnic, too interconnected with the political machinery he relied on. He had denied it publicly for years. Now, the world saw what he refused to admit. And so, the pivot began. It didn't happen with a speech. It didn't start with a press release. It started in silence, the kind of silence that comes with embarrassment. In the days following Apalachin, Hoover ordered internal reviews. He summoned regional directors. Files that had been sitting dormant for years were suddenly retrieved, dusted, and rewritten. The Bureau didn't say they had been wrong. They said the Mafia had grown bolder, as if Apalachin had changed something in the criminals. Not in the investigators, but behind the scenes, the shift was absolute. The Bureau moved. Wiretaps were authorized, quietly, then widely. Payphones. Near-known mob hangouts were tapped. Hotel rooms, restaurant-back booths. Surveillance vans appeared in Brooklyn, Chicago, Tampa, Detroit. Cameras with long lenses watched bakeries. Retired agents were called back in. New recruits were trained not just in law, but in observation, how to track movements, decode signals, understand the unspoken grammar of organized crime. Informants became the Bureau's new weapon. Where once silence had ruled the street, now fear made cracks in the code. Small-time hustlers caught on gambling charges were squeezed for names. Bartenders with drug connections were promised immunity. Jealous lovers overlooked soldiers' ex-wives. Anyone with proximity to power became a potential asset. And somewhere in those taped conversations, in the hushed voices and coded language, the Bureau began to see the structure. This wasn't a loose collection of thugs. It was a system. It had hierarchy, protocol, territory, discipline. The commission wasn't a myth. It was real. It met. It resolved disputes. It moved money like a multinational corporation, and it killed. With administrative precision, Hoover, of course, claimed he had known all along. He began appearing in public again, stone-faced, declaring that organized crime has grown into a national concern. He spoke of emerging patterns and intelligence developments, as if he hadn't spent the previous decade erasing memos and downplaying informant reports. But the cameras didn't care. What mattered was that the machinery had started. The Bureau launched the Top Hoodlum program, assigning agents to specific crime figures in every major city. New York's 5 families were split among teams. Every known associate was watched, every front business tracked, If a man disappeared, they noted who cried. If a wedding occurred, they recorded who attended. Routines became rituals of surveillance. No handshake went unobserved. No silence went unquestioned. In Philadelphia, Kansas City, Cleveland, agents began connecting dots. Photos were pinned to corkboards, maps filled with pushpins, and in those files a new picture of America emerged. Not one of freedom and enterprise, but of shadows and control. It was Apalachin that had shown them the frame. Now the Bureau was painting the canvas, and with each arrest, each raid, each wiretap, the Mafia's myth began to break. But the Bureau wasn't satisfied with piecemeal arrests. They wanted architecture, and so they began to ask a bigger question. How do you convict a system? The answer came years later in a courtroom in the dry. Language of statutes and legal code, and the form of RICO, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, passed in 1970, born from years of watching and listening, a law that allowed prosecutors to charge not just individuals, but organizations to say for the first time this man did not pull the trigger, but he ordered it, and that matters. Without Apalachin, there is no RICO. Without that single raid, that butcher's whisper, that trooper's notebook, the federal government might have remained blind for another decade. The law might never have evolved to match the crime, but it did. And from that moment on, the Bureau didn't blink. They sent agents undercover, into social clubs, into construction unions, into wedding halls and funeral parlors. They flipped underbosses, they tracked payphones, they recorded everything, and one by one, the empire began to crumble, not from gunfire, but from paperwork, from affidavits, from grand juries, from testimony that echoed in courtrooms, while men sat stone-faced in Armani suits, watching the world they built turn to ash. J. Edgar Hoover died in 1972. By then, he had reclaimed his image, at least on paper, but in history, his failure to see what had always been in front of him remains a scar beneath the Bureau's polished seal, because in the end it wasn't the Bureau that saw first. It was a butcher. It was a trooper. And Apalachin, that single breach in the forest, forced the FBI to finally look, and once they did, they never looked away again. In the end, the man who had once pulled the strings of an empire sat in a prison cell, staring at a concrete wall that would never blink. Vito Genovese had gotten what he wanted. For a moment, Apalachin had been his stage, his silent bid to crown himself king of the American underworld. He summoned the heads of families from across the country, forced them to look him in the eye, to sit at the table he had set. But power, when exposed too early, becomes a curse, and Apalachin didn't make him untouchable. It made him a target. The headlines were still fresh when the pressure began to build. Federal agents turned their gaze directly on Genovese. His rivals smelled blood. His name had been whispered in too many rooms, printed in too many newspapers. It was no longer invisible. And for a man like Vito, who moved best in shadow, that visibility was fatal. In 1958, just a year after Apalachin, the first real blow landed. He was indicted on narcotics trafficking, a charge he had long danced around, but never worn outright. For years, he had built his fortune through the heroin trade, routing shipments through Havana, Marseille, and Sicily, distributing it across Harlem and Newark. But the system that had protected him, the layers of insulation, the buffers, the silence, had cracked. Someone talked. The arrest wasn't dramatic. It didn't need to be by then. Genovese had retreated into his fortress in New Jersey, surrounded by men who no longer looked him in the eye. When the knock came, he answered it like a man already bracing for history. At trial, the prosecution laid out the web-coded phone. Calls, cash transfers, street dealers linked by unbroken lines back to Vito. He denied it all. He sat in court with his hands folded, eyes fixed forward, expression unreadable. But something inside had collapsed. In 1959, he was convicted and sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. The headlines returned. Mafia boss gets 15. Genovese sent away. The Doan falls. And just like that, the man who had tried to rewrite the hierarchy of organized crime was reduced to an inmate, prisoner number 123-05004, at the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary. Inside there were no lieutenants, no soldiers, no leather-backed chairs. There was a cot, a toilet, 4 concrete walls. His voice didn't echo like it once had, and though he tried to pull strings, managing bits of the family business through coded letters and messengers, the grip had loosened, because outside the world kept moving. Carlo Gambino rose. Quietly, smoothly, without theatrics, Costello vanished into semi-retirement, still pulling influence but letting younger men carry the weight. Joe Bonanno expanded his reach. The families realigned. The commission adapted to survive, and they did so without veto. In prison, Genovese grew bitter. He saw betrayal in every shadow. He accused old allies of setting him up. He ordered hits from behind bars, including a failed plot against a government witness. His paranoia became legend. Meals were left uneaten. Visitors were interrogated. He paced his cell like a man replaying a conversation he could never change. He had always believed ambition was armor, that rising to the top meant you earned safety, but Apalachin had proven the opposite. Power had made him visible, and visibility, in his world, meant death or a cage. By the early 1960s, Genovese's health began to fail. He suffered from high blood pressure, heart issues, and the slow erosion of control. He still issued orders, still tried to maintain the image of command, but the world outside the walls had learned to live without him. His empire, once sprawling and meticulously managed, fractured. His soldiers shifted allegiance. His name became less feared, more whispered, a warning, not a threat. On February 14, 1969, Vito Genovese died in prison from a heart attack. No grand procession followed. No lavish funeral lined with black cars and bowed heads. He was buried in St. John's Cemetery in Queens, the same soil that had once grown his ambition. But without fanfare, without fear, just a headstone, just a name. Vito had tried to become legend, to build a legacy so undeniable that it would outlive him. But in the end, Apalachin became his legacy, not as a triumph, but as a mistake, a single overreach that shattered the illusion of invincibility he had crafted over decades. That summit in the woods, that gathering of power he believed would seal his supremacy, became the nail in the coffin. It exposed him, it chased him into the light, and in that light he didn't find a crown. He found the end. It began with the boots, thick leather boots, cracking from age, planted in the frost-dusted grass behind a house that would never again be. Called ordinary, they belonged to a state trooper, jaw clenched against the cold, staring up at a house whose windows stared back with the empty eyes of shame. The boots stomped out a cigarette. A thin plume of smoke trailed upward into the November sky, where no one would see it. But the eyes of the nation already had. Joseph Barber's home in Apalachin, New York, once a quiet rural estate surrounded by evergreens and modest fences, was no longer his castle. It was a stage scorched with the heat of 1,000 flashbulbs, 1,000 questions he would never live down. Barber had dreamed of prestige. He wasn't just a local host. In his mind, he was Caesar welcoming the empire's finest. But after the raid, the only empire left was the charred ruin of his reputation. Once, he had walked through his manicured yard with a cigar pinched between his fingers and a chest full of self-importance. Now he shuffled from room to room, dragging the weight of a name no longer whispered with respect, but muttered with ridicule. In the weeks after Apalachin, Joseph Barbara found himself at the center of a storm he never believed he had summoned. Federal agents descended on him like hawks circling a carcass. Subpoenas were issued. Testimonies were demanded. Headlines bled across state lines. Barbara, the host of the Mafia summit, he was no longer a businessman, nor a respected community figure. He was the punchline in every prosecutor's opening argument. They investigated his bottling company, his frozen meat business, his finances. They questioned his employees, his friends, his doctor. The estate, once a symbol of modest success, was probed like a crime scene. Soil was sampled, gates measured. Everything that had once been private became evidence. And through it all, Joseph Barbara claimed ignorance. He sat before grand juries and said he had no idea who those men were, said they were there for lunch, a barbecue, said it was a get-together, friends from the old neighborhood. He stuck to his lines like a desperate actor flubbing a role he never rehearsed, but no one bought it, not the FBI, not the press, not even the men he had once hoped to impress. To them, to the commission, he was no longer a trusted ally. He was an embarrassment. In the months that followed, Barbara noticed the cold more than he used to. Not just the upstate winter biting at his knees, but the colder looks from associates who stopped calling, the silence of telephones that used to ring before sunrise. Men who had once toasted him with expensive scotch now wouldn't return. A glance, his name, once written in cigar smoke and loyalty, faded like breath on a mirror. The humiliation was corrosive. A man like Barbara had built his life on appearances, and now even the mirrors seemed to flinch when he looked into them. His health, already fragile before the raid, began to collapse under the weight of stress and shame, angina, chronic fatigue, sleep that wouldn't come without pills. His heart, heavy with regret, sputtered like an engine in the cold. By 1959, Joseph Barbara was a shadow. He moved slowly, ate little, smiled only for appearances, and even that, rarely. He spent hours alone on the porch, staring out into the woods, the same trees that once shielded his house from suspicion, now feeling like prison bars. Occasionally, he would speak to his wife in short, tired phrases. He never talked about that day, but she saw it in his face. He never stopped reliving it. He still swore innocence. He told anyone who would listen that he had no idea who those men were, no knowledge of any plot, no role in any syndicate. But the louder he insisted, the fewer people believed. The performance had gone stale to his dying breath. Joseph Barbara clung to the narrative he had constructed in those first panicked minutes during the raid. A man blindsided by events, betrayed by coincidence, but deep down he must have known. He must have heard the echoes, the truth trailing behind every door that closed in his face. The irony? All he ever wanted was a seat at the table. He got it, and then became the reason the table was flipped over in front of the entire world. On June 17, 1959, just 2 years after the Apalachin debacle, Joseph Barbara collapsed at his home. He died of a heart attack. No guards, no headlines. Just a man in a house that had once held the underworld's crown for one terrible day. He died disgraced, not by a bullet, not by betrayal, but by the slow, suffocating poison of a dream. Gone wrong, the estate was sold in pieces, the lawn overgrown. The headlines yellowed in boxes no one would open again. But for those who remember, the name Joseph Barbara still holds a tragic weight, not as a kingpin, not as a mastermind, but as a man who tried to host history and ended up buried beneath it. The road to Apalachin is still there, overgrown now in places, the gravel faded into brush and memory, What was once a driveway for men in silk ties and cashmere overcoats is now used by delivery trucks and deer. But the house remains, the trees haven't forgotten, and neither has history. Apalachin was not a finale, not a climactic arrest that tore the Mafia from its roots, but it was a pivot, a crack in the glass that never healed. What happened in that sleepy New York hamlet on November 14th, 1957, shattered an illusion that had endured for decades. The myth that organized crime was exaggerated, romanticized, a figment of pulp writers and press sensationalism. That myth died on Joseph Barbara's lawn. In the weeks that followed, newspapers called it a comedy. Reporters chuckled over stories of grown men scrambling through hedges and hiding in chicken coops. Editorial cartoons sketched caricatures of overweight gangsters slipping on frozen grass. But behind the laughter was something else, fear, and something deeper still, revelation. For the public, it was a glimpse into a world they'd been told didn't exist. But for the FBI, for law enforcement, for the halls of Washington, it was humiliation. J. Edgar Hoover, the most powerful lawman in America, had spent years denying the Mafia's existence. Now he stood exposed, not just to the press, but to his own agents. Apalachin had been a slap, and Hoover, once silent, would now roar. In the years after the raid, the FBI underwent a transformation. Wiretaps, surveillance, undercover work, all tools that had previously been used sparingly, now became routine. The Bureau created its own top hoodlum program, assigning agents in every field office to track the movements, phone calls, and meetings of suspected mobsters. Cities like Chicago, New York, Cleveland, Detroit, and Buffalo became war zones of paperwork and paranoia. But the true legacy of Apalachin didn't unfold in weeks or months. It simmered for decades. In 1970, 13 years after the raid, Congress passed the RICO Act, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Statute. It was designed specifically to dismantle the infrastructure of organized crime. For the first time, prosecutors could charge not just the man who pulled the trigger, but the one who ordered it, funded it, or simply stood to benefit from it. RICO was the legal version of pulling up the floorboards and indicting the entire foundation. Names like Rudy Giuliani and Robert Morgenthau would later become famous for wielding that power. Mob trials in the 1980s and 90s, sprawling affairs filled with wiretap evidence. Mafia turncoats and televised verdicts all trace their lineage back to that cold morning in Apalachin, because before then, the Mafia was folklore. After Apalachin, it was case law. But the legacy of that meeting didn't stop in courtrooms. It moved into culture. Mario Puzo was a freelance writer in the early 1960s, struggling to pay debts when he began researching stories about Italian-American crime families. Though he never explicitly cited Apalachin, the public obsession that followed it helped shape the climate that welcomed The Godfather. And when Francis Ford Coppola brought it to the screen in 1972, audiences watched in awe as power and violence danced in candlelit rooms. That scene in The Godfather Part 2, the Senate hearing, Michael Corleone on trial, the whisper of betrayal from a brother brought back from exile. It echoed the very real hearings that had taken place after Apalachin. And years later, when Martin Scorsese brought Goodfellas to life, the paranoia, the hierarchy, the constant pressure to perform and survive, all of it drew oxygen from the fire lit in that upstate backyard. There's a line in The Godfather: "A man who doesn't spend time with his family can never be a real man." It sounds noble, but Apalachin showed us what those families really looked like, and how fragile loyalty could be when spotlights hit the stage. For the Mafia itself, the raid marked a change in behavior, not just structure. Gone were the large meetings. No more backyard barbecues for dons and capos. Business became colder, leaner, more compartmentalized. Messages were relayed through third parties. Surnames were used sparingly. The veil that had once been sheer was now made of lead. Some of the most powerful men in that era, Vito Genovese, Joe Profaci, San Giancana, found their influence shrinking. Their movements watched. Others, like Carlo Gambino, adapted. Gambino had been at Apalachin, but quietly, at the edge, he understood what the spotlight meant. After the raid, he transformed his family into the most powerful crime syndicate in America by avoiding press, attention, and spectacle. He became the embodiment of post-Apalachin strategy. Operate in silence, strike only when necessary, and leave no photographs behind. There's an irony, too, in how Apalachin transformed the Mafia's mystique. The very exposure that damaged their operations also made them immortal in popular culture. From HBO's The Sopranos to Netflix's documentaries, the fascination never faded. Joe Barbara's home, long sold off, has become a quiet pilgrimage. Site for crime buffs, tourists still photograph the gates where cops stood confused, where black Cadillacs idled under a canopy of autumn leaves. Yet for all the films and books and trials that followed, one truth remains. Apalachin was a reminder that no secret lasts forever. It forced the government to admit what it had long ignored. It forced the Mafia to evolve, and it forced the public to realize that the shadows had a shape, a structure, and names. The story of organized crime in America is not one of sudden revolutions, but of slow recognitions. Apalachin didn't destroy the Mafia, but it made pretending impossible. It was the beginning of the end of innocence, for Hoover, for the press, for the men who believed they were invisible. And in that way, it became something more than a raid. It became a mirror, a rare moment, when the nation turned its face toward the smoke and saw what had always been burning underneath. Because that's the thing about legacy. You don't get to choose how you're remembered. You only get to choose how long you think you can hide. The fog that morning was thick, a gray veil rolling over the hills of upstate New York, like a slow exhale from something ancient. The pine trees stood like quiet sentinels, unmoving, unaware that history was crawling through their underbrush. On that cold November day in 1957, in the sleepy hamlet of Apalachin, the leaves rustled, not from the wind, but from the weight of men running, well-dressed men, expensive shoes sinking in mud, fedora brims catching on branches, suit jackets tearing like paper through the undergrowth. They, scattered like ghosts fleeing light, men with names, names that built cities, bought judges, rigged ports, moved silent fortunes through backroom channels and blood. Some held power over entire industries, others over life and death. But here, in the woods outside a suburban backyard, they looked more like panicked salesmen than underworld titans. One officer would later say it was like watching a flock of peacocks try to outrun a storm. Their silk ties and diamond cufflinks didn't belong here, not in this dirt, not under this sky, but that was the thing. The Mafia had always hidden its truth in suits, fine cars, Italian restaurants, and Catholic funerals. This was the first time the curtain dropped, and what the public saw was not invincible. The photographers arrived late, but the shutter clicks still echoed through history. Black and white images of men shielding their faces, eyes squinting against a November sun they weren't supposed to be under. They weren't supposed to be seen together, certainly not like this. Carmen Galante ducking into a car, Joe Profaci caught mid-step, Vito Genovese staring straight ahead, lips tight with fury. The Apalachin meeting was never supposed to be remembered. That was its design, a private summit of bosses to confirm power, divide territories, bless pipelines of heroin, gambling, and union control. It was a coronation disguised as a barbecue. But the moment the police arrived, the illusion shattered. In the silence of those trees, the Mafia was made visible. Decades later, scholars and agents and filmmakers would all dissect what went wrong. Some said it was hubris, too many cars, too much traffic for a rural road. Others blamed Joseph Barbara, the local boss who hosted the meeting in his yard. But the deeper truth ran colder than miscalculation. It was about something older than greed, the idea that power, if hidden well enough, became immortal. Apalachin proved that shadows don't always protect. From the Bureau's perspective, it was a miracle, a windfall they didn't earn. For years, J. Edgar Hoover had denied the very existence of a national crime syndicate. He'd called it a myth, a Hollywood creation, but in those woods, myth turned evidence. The headlines read like fiction. Dozens of mob leaders captured in New York State woods, and the world realized what Hoover could no longer ignore. Inside law enforcement, Apalachin became doctrine. The FBI shifted its focus almost overnight. Surveillance techniques, where refined, informant programs expanded, wiretaps became standard. The Mafia, once operating with the elegance of a private bank, now found its vault cracked open and cataloged. And though RICO, the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, wouldn't arrive until 1970, its seed was planted in the mud of that backyard. Hollywood took note, too. Apalachin's ghost lingered in The Godfather's quiet gatherings, in Goodfellas' smoky backrooms, in the long dinner tables where bosses debated territories with wine-stained fingers. It wasn't just a story, it was a revelation, a moment when the secret world bent under the weight of daylight. But memory, like power, is a fragile thing. Some of the men who ran that day would later deny being there. Others laughed it off in interviews, a misunderstanding, they'd say, a coincidence of cousins and barbecues. Yet none of them could undo the photographs. The lenses didn't care for excuses. They captured truth in grayscale. The Mafia, in tailored suits, cornered by time. Apalachin did not destroy organized crime, but it reshaped it. The Mafia went deeper underground. Fewer public meetings, more middlemen. The bosses became quieter, more paranoid. The once celebrated image of the neighborhood don, shaking hands and blessing marriages, began to fade. It was replaced by phone calls in coded language, by anonymous threats, by silence stretched thin over suspicion. For Joseph Barbara, the host of the meeting, the consequences were immediate and irreversible. His reputation collapsed, his health followed, and while he died denying any knowledge of what truly took place that day, his name had already become synonymous with failure. A man who opened his door to history and found it unwilling to leave quietly. But Apalachin's legacy wasn't just law enforcement or Hollywood or headlines. It was cultural, spiritual, even. It marked the end of an era when the Mafia believed it was invisible. It showed the world that even empires built in whispers can be shattered by a single knock at the door. There's a photograph, perhaps the most famous of all, where several men are being marched away. Surrounded by troopers, their eyes are distant, their shoulders stiff. In that frozen moment, you can see something deeper than defeat. You see the realization that the veil has lifted, that they have been seen, and being seen is sometimes the beginning of the end. Today, Apalachin is a sleepy place again. Quiet streets, aging homes. A local historical sign marks the site of the raid, but most who pass it don't stop. The house is just a house. The trees have grown taller, the world has moved on. But the ghosts of that morning still linger in the soil. You can almost hear it. If you stand still long enough, the rustle of expensive shoes and dead leaves, the whisper of panic through pine needles, the hollow click of a camera's shutter slicing through silence. In the end, the Apalachin meeting was not a war, no bullets were fired, no one died, and yet it became a battlefield, one where illusion was slain, and reality, however unwelcome, rose in its place. It was a meeting never meant to be remembered, and for that reason, it never faded.